Now, reports from the National Bureau of Statistics on Consumer Price Index, which measures inflation, in recent times have been queried and not necessarily garnered much acceptance from the general public, as the data does not necessarily reflect market realities, according to some quarters. Nigerians have continuously decried rising prices of food items and other commodities in the market, even as the Yuletide approaches. Now, according to other reports as well, the Consumer Price Index has continually declined for the 7th consecutive month to 15.99% in the month of October. The figure is 1.76 percentage points higher than the 14.23 percentage points recorded in the month of October. Amidst the rise in inflation, Nigeria's gross domestic product also showed some slowing or contraction of about 4.03% in real terms in the third quarter of this year, showing a sustained growth over the last 4 quarters since the recession witnessed in 2020. Well, let's now join our analysts for today to help us understand the calculation of these inflation figures and the slow rise we're seeing in the country's GDP growth rate. I have with me Managing Director and the Chief Executive Officer of Kairos Capital, Sam Chidoka. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, starting off our conversation, we have consistently seen declines in terms of the volume of inflationary pressure Nigeria is facing. But there's this conflicting report as well, which says that all of this reducing or declining pressure does not necessarily translate to an ease in the market space. Some also say, well, the comparison is between last year and this year. What are your thoughts on really how we should tally best these figures and also make sense of it in terms of translating what happens in the market to real-time data?
Thanks, David, and thanks for having me. Well, it's to start from top and explain how inflation works. So you find that typically most people look at inflation when they say the inflation figure is coming down. They are wondering prices of food, goods and consumables are actually going up. But you have to look at it in terms of it's a basket. It's a basket of things that come together to give you the inflation figure. So it's a composite inflation figure you are seeing. So while prices may actually be increasing for certain items in the economy, prices may be coming down for certain other items, and then the average also. Secondly, what inflation measures is the rate of increase measured against time. So, for instance, if the rate at which prices are going up have decelerated in this period, you would, while prices are still going up, you will notice that inflation figures are coming down. So, for instance, if last month price of yam went from 100 naira to 120, that's a 20% increase. But if it went from 120 to 125, there was another increase, but the difference between 20 naira and 5 naira will mean that the rate of inflation is lower. So it's key for people to understand that when we say that inflation is it's now coming down this month compared to quarter on quarter or year on year or month on month, it's possible while prices of goods and services are still high. So I think that is just an understanding of how inflation figures work.
Well, for the layman, it's quite difficult to understand that. And part of the issues, as we speak right now, is the fact that we are having double-digit inflation rate in terms of our food inflation. Now, that's one of the most difficult challenges for any government to face, its ability to feed its citizens. Nigerians are groaning, and the body language of government does not necessarily reflect an understanding of all of these figures and even the fact that we have food crisis at hand. What is the likely worst-case scenario if we continue to have the sharp spike in food inflation?
So yeah, you're right. If you look at inflation figures released by MBS, you find out that food inflation is still over 18%, and that's pretty much very high. So in terms of the composite nature of inflation, food inflation is still high, and that's what affects everybody, from the very poor to the very rich. Food inflation is real, and especially for the poor. So the point about food inflation is that we have a serious case of insecurity pervading around the country. So that has really affected people's ability to farm and to be productive. If you look at the farm belt, if you look at Benue and look at the northern part of Nigeria, that's where you've had banditry, that's where you've had kidnapping, that's where you have farmers and herders clashes. So all those clashes have made sure that we don't have, the harvest is not as we expected. And because you have less produce, inflation would definitely be high. So what I would say to government is that we need to deal with the issue of insecurity. We need to provide security. That's one. Secondly is that when we talk about agriculture, I often make the point that the kind of agriculture we should be talking about is not subsistence agriculture, but mechanized agriculture. Subsistence agriculture can only go as far as possible, but when you mechanize agriculture, then people understand the planting circle, people understand fertilization, people understand irrigation, people understand seed quality and timing and all of that, then your harvest definitely becomes larger per square kilometer, per square mile, or per square meter. So in terms of agriculture, we still need a lot of education to happen. CBN has been backing up the agricultural sector with a lot of funding, but I find that many of those loans are going bad simply because some of the farmers don't yet understand what mechanized farming is.
And talking about mechanized farming, let's use Lagos State as the model state now. Lagos is taking certain aggressive steps towards ensuring that we have food security within this region. But at the end of the day, the pace of achieving this from the point of view of prospect to reality is still relatively slow. Yes, there are conversations around the agenda, the commission is speaking on activities to consolidate and all of this, but it's still at a slow pace. The year 2021 is largely gone. Prepping ahead for 2022, not missing the right seasons, the conversation about new food hubs. You've made mention of insecurity, but for regional, sub-national levels now and regional levels in terms of integration, sharing of resources, blueprints and a whole lot more, and taking action, what's the next step you think state governors have to take? Let's leave the authorities at the federal state to deal with matters federally, and state governments now taking the bull by the horn. You should be able to feed your citizens, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, David, I agree. But you see, the truth of the matter is that at the subnational level, the truth is that aside Lagos State and maybe Rivers State, how many states are actually financially viable? How many states would you, if you stop the FAC allocation, the states will function? There are not many states in Nigeria that would function without the federal allocation. So at the end of the day, the federal government is still very important to distilling of resources at the subnational and at the local government levels, because that's where the funding really comes from. But if you look at Lagos as an example, I think that Lagos has taken the bull by the horn in certain things that Lagos is doing. Look at the rice mill that has been under construction. I think it's going to be completed in this quarter or first quarter of next year and all of that. And trying to, if you go to the Ekpe axis of Lagos, you see a lot of farming and fish farming especially going on, and a lot of some form of farming activities going on, and the state government is supporting that as well. But I agree with you that the states need to find places to collaborate. There are some states that have higher yield in terms of certain products, but they just don't have the value chain for further productivity. Maybe they need to find ways of aligning with other states, and maybe one state can produce the raw material, another state can refine and reproduce, and then you can now talk about exports. But then again, some of the states are hampered by the fact that the states themselves are not doing enough to generate enough IGR to run the states and invest in agriculture and other things, apart from Lagos, maybe Rivers, and maybe Delta State.
Let's also take cues from the likes of the United Arab Emirates. Now, to take one singular item, tourism, and use that to transfer whatever project and the prospects for other sectors within their economy. Every single state in Nigeria has some commercial viability, an area of comparative advantage, be it shea butter, be it local production of maize and a whole lot more, be it Lagos as a coastal state and a whole lot more spread across the country, those even with mineral deposits and more. What sort of agenda do you also expect in terms of looking at now the 2022 budgetary allocation, the scrutiny around all of these documents and papers? How would you want to see things turn around in terms of using their singular products, their areas of comparative advantages, fuel their economic recovery growth rate, and then drop down prices of basic amenities such as food as well?
So, I mean, that's a very good question, but I would like to look at it in a more fundamental manner. If you look at it fundamentally, the way we are structured, our constitution and all, makes it difficult for any state to really do some of these things that we're talking about. So if you think about it, Lagos is a coastal state, but the waterways don't belong to Lagos, they belong to the federal government. There is gold in Zamfara state, it doesn't belong to the state. There is coal in Enugu state, it doesn't belong to the state. There's oil in Bayelsa state, in Rivers state, it doesn't belong to the state. Anything under the ground belongs to the federal government. That's how our laws work today. So fundamentally, I'm of the opinion that we should change those laws and let states own what is in the states, fundamentally. However, back to where we are today, using the 1999 Constitution, I think that there is still so much that states can do. If you look at some of the states, I'll give you an example of two states. Look at a state like Anambra State and look at a state like Abia State. Anambra State has perhaps one of the biggest markets in Western Africa, in Onitsha. Aba is one of the biggest trading hubs also in West Africa. I think that there's so much they can do to harness the opportunities in those places. But the question is, are we seeing those opportunities? Are we able to tap into those opportunities? And that's why it's important that at the subnational level, we all need to get involved. My advice to governors is to look down instead of looking up to the federal government and see what is within their state and see how they can harness and grow their IGI and become self-sustaining without running cap in hand to the federal government at the slightest opportunity.
And also talking about not running to the federal government cap in hand, let's also look at winning ourselves off these allocations. Now, in terms of the allocations, first and foremost, there's the agenda pushing for now much more resources to the local government area than looking at state levels, and then we have the federal government level as well. What also do you think should be the line of action really now, if we to just use little examples here, in terms of much more investment in processing and a whole lot more, just gradual steps within their control, and then areas outside their control, like you've made mention of, then there should be conversations with the executive arm of government, with the House of Reps and a whole lot more. How do we tap into these resources a little more aggressively, a little more strategically? Do you understand where I'm coming from?
I understand, David. And to be honest, I'm as perplexed as you are when you think about it. So there are 309 House of Rep members who come from different states. There are, I think, 100 plus senators who come from different states. You would expect that when they go to the National Assembly, that what they should push for is an amendment of the fact that the resources that belong to the states should be harnessed by the states and used for the benefit of the states. But really, there's a whole lot of politics around that. And I'm not a politician and I don't understand the politics. We're just talking about common sense. I think that we should have laws that allow federating units to own what they produce and to get the resources from and pay something to the central, have a weaker center, have the states really. That's why if you go to America, certain states are richer than other states because of either what they have under the ground or what they've been able to do on top of the ground, right? In terms of the local government, I think that the new rule that ensures that revenues of local government go directly to the local government is good, but we haven't quite seen the traction at the local government level to activate what they could do with that funding. Maybe it's too soon, or maybe just the local government leaders don't yet understand that they ought to become productive. As far as the subnationals are concerned, I agree with you. We need to find ways of being productive. States, governors must sit down and find ways of finding their comparative advantage. What can they produce in the states? What can they add to the value chain? How can they make progress? How do you become a hub for certain things? Why wouldn't people want to go to Tinapa for holiday? Why wouldn't people want to go to Ogudu Cattle Ranch for holidays? Why can't that be, instead of going to Dubai, why don't we go there? What are the things that need to be done? But at the base of all of this is the fact that we need to solve the insecurity issues, which is back to the federal government. Many people would rather travel out of Nigeria than travel within Nigeria just for safety reasons.
Let's now shift our conversation to a bigger picture. One of the most recent reports we have is that of the GDP, a slower contraction level this time around, 4.03%. Yes, it's an improvement, but not necessarily the volume we recorded in the second quarter of the year, which is above 5% now. What do you make of this figure currently? And looking at some of the indicators you've made mention of, the biggest contributor to the GDP reports we've had so far is the non-oil sector. We look at manufacturing, we look at the services, we look at telecommunication sector and much more. These are developing much more robustly, but we need to do more. Hence, we need much more investment to drive these sectors. We need better power, we need better road infrastructure, and a whole lot more machinery to fuel these other sectors of the economy. What do you make of the figures?
Well, I would say, first of all, let's celebrate little wins. 4% GDP growth in Q3. You can argue that is a base year effect because Q3 2020, I think, negative about 3%. So maybe base year effect, that's why you have 4% positive, but it's still good. I think that if you annualize the GDP from what we've seen so far, we'll probably do over 2% for 2021. Not good enough, because if we agree that our population is growing at over 3%, we need to have GDP growth of somewhere around 5 to 6% to move the needle. But 2% is still better than when we were in a recession, or when we had just 1% growth, I think last year or so. So yes, I agree with you. The major drivers is the non-oil. Oil was just about 7% of GDP. The major drivers are still the usual suspects. Agriculture, services, manufacturing have always been the major drivers of our GDP. But then again, you need to get in more foreign investment to catalyze this growth and to make the growth more double digit in those industries. It's just what we have is just not enough to move the needle. And to have foreign investments, you will come back to the same thing. You need to deal with insecurity. You need to deal with power. You need to deal with infrastructure. Yes, the government is going in the right direction as far as some certain infrastructure is concerned, but we need to do more in terms of infrastructure, especially power. And then we need to deal with the insecurity issues. And then we need to deal also with policy flip-flop. You're not going to have people invest in your economy when they are not certain that the policy upon which they came in will not be the same policy 2 months or 3 months down the line. If you combine these things, I think that we'll begin to get it right.
We're already having the scrutiny of the 2022 budget proposal underway. We're also looking at the finance bill also coming to bear, which would also be passed alongside a preparation bill now for 2022. But talking about some of the elements that we have to look at fundamentally, you're one of those who would argue that the Nigerian economy is already diversified. So it's cliche to go back and say we have to diversify an already diversified economy. Getting things right now, what sort of scrutiny do you expect of this document to help us consolidate on the gains we've made this year so that for next year we'd have a bigger record? We're looking at well over 4% for next year and a whole lot more. We're looking at inflation rate be at about 13% and all of those. How do you see things taking shape under the scrutiny for a much more bigger recovery?
Yes, again, you're absolutely right. I find it funny when people say we should diversify the economy, and I always say the economy is diversified as it is. What we need to diversify is our source of revenue. Oil and gas is still providing major revenue for the economy. We need to further diversify that. If you look at the numbers over the years, the contribution of oil and gas to our revenue is also coming down gradually, but we need to push that needle and diversify our revenue. But as far as the economy is concerned, yes, you're correct. The economy is diversified when you look at it from a GDP standpoint. In terms of the budgets, I find that our budgets over time are becoming like a ritual, something that we must do and we have to do, because when you have a budget that doesn't speak to what actually really happens in the year, then you wonder if we're really getting it right. Remember actually that when the budget is passed and signed into law, it's actually a law that must be obeyed. And there ought to be consequences when they are not obeyed. But in Nigeria, we find there are no consequences when the budget is not obeyed. And sometimes it's just not even as good as the paper that it was written on. I'm hopeful that in 2022, we will have having the budget cycle of January to December is good. And I'm hoping that if we pass the budget and continue that cycle, we can start implementing very quickly. One of the things that you find with our budget for non-performance is non-releases. So you have budgeted amounts, but which are never released. And I think that we should match the budget with actuals and do our best possible to get them to work. Normally, we're almost 100% on the recurrent expenditure. It's always on the capital side. It could be because of paucity of funds, but I mean, we're borrowing quite a ton right now. So we should do our best to continue to make sure that we match the budget with actuals and actually spend the budget money on where it matters.
Mr. Chidoka, we are now wrapping up our conversation. I would like us to wrap up in the next 2 minutes. Now, let's look at some agenda or some opinions or stance which say that the level of borrowing we have as at now is going to likely stifle any sort of economic recovery we would likely see if we are not using them right. Now, the argument as well as repayment of all of these. By the end of the day, the argument around the implementation index is critical to ensure that whatever volume of borrowings we have are transferred to support the infrastructure development agenda. Hence, we can have a stronger GDP growth rate and contribution from the key sectors of the economy. And even looking at emergent sectors as well and other areas, low-hanging fruits, which we could also consolidate on. What's your take on our borrowing level, revenue generation strategy, and also consolidating on infrastructure development?
Yeah, so I worry a bit about our borrowing levels. I know that the managers of the economy will be quick to say that in terms of debt to GDP, we're still within manageable fronts. But when I look at debt to revenue, we are definitely not. When your debt service is over 90% of revenue, then there is a challenge, right? But in terms of borrowing, I don't think that borrowing is a major problem. I don't think that. Yes, we borrowed quite a bit in the last 5-6 years, but the question is, what have you used the monies for? We built rails, that's good. It eases transportation, and that also it eases movement of goods and people, and that should add its effect to the GDP. However, the question is, how are we running the rails? I just saw in the news this morning that the workers of Nigerian Railway Corporation are about to go on strike. That shouldn't happen. Are we getting enough from the rails to even service some of the loans that we're taking? So whereas I think that borrowing is not a bad thing, but when we borrow, we should use it more for capital expenditure and do our best possible to make sure that those things, the infrastructure, has the capacity to generate cash flows that can add to repayment of those loans. And one of the ways to do it is by commercialization and privatization. Even if you decide not to privatize because they are critical assets, you can commercialize. You can go on long-dated leases of those assets to private sector to run those assets and repay back to government, and use part of those funds to pay down some of the loans. Because really, Nigerian government especially is not very good at running institutions.
Well, I'm one of those who's waiting for the finance bill to also come into bear. We need to see what new waivers, incentives are there to help stimulate the economy. We just want to see the Nigerian economy bounce back a little more strongly. We would like to see insecurity also being attended to, and the average Nigerian proud to be called a Nigerian. Thank you very much once again for your time on the show today.
Thank you.